women's property ownership came about the same time as women's suffrage in the West. So it was part of becoming seen as a whole citizen, as a person that had basic rights in a democracy. So no, you can never let that lens go.
A home is not just a roof over your head. It's a place where some of the most important parts of our lives happen, where we look after ourselves, our partners, our children, our friends. It's where we build our lives. When a home feels safe, it's where the most important caretaking happens. And when it doesn't, it can become a place of violence and fear. And caretaking responsibilities can also shape how people access housing. Across cultures, there are gendered expectations. For some, the expectation for a long time has been that women stay home to take care of children, while men work to earn enough money to support the entire family. For others, those expectations and perceptions have evolved over generations, with more women entering the workforce to build careers, and both partners sharing child-rearing roles and housekeeping tasks. The data shows us that the nuclear family is increasingly uncommon nowadays, while single-person households are on the rise. How does a woman's role in the household impact her chances of finding housing? What happens when a woman becomes a single parent, returns to work after pregnancy, or must take care of an ill partner or parent? I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. What could a gender-equal housing system look like? How would we know it if we saw it? That's what we'll find out in Season 2 of Homes Not Houses. This episode of Homes Not Houses explores women's relationship with care and work practices and how they intersect with housing. With me this episode is Chifley Research Institute's Executive Director, Emma Dawson. Emma is one of Australia's leading public policy architects and political thinkers. She's a co-founder of Per Capita, which she led from 2016 to 2025, and has been a vocal advocate for progressive policies for decades.
Thank you so much for your time today, Emma. It's so nice to have you on the podcast.
Lovely to be on the podcast.
Yeah, so good. I want to start with asking about your own relationship with housing and gender equality and how you came to be working in this area, amongst many other things that you work on.
Sure. Well, I'm a Gen X woman, smack bang in the middle of Gen X, and I've had a fairly typical Gen X experience with housing. I rented for a long time in my 20s and into my 30s in a very dilapidated old workers' cottage with an outside toilet and bathroom and crumbling walls and black mould and all of that good stuff. And then when I was in my mid-30s, I got a redundancy package and had a little bit of cash for the first time in my life and was about to go overseas again. And my parents said, listen, probably time to think about buying a home. And that was scary because I, was a single 34-year-old or something, 32-year-old, something like that. 32, I think I was. My sister was about to get married and my parents were paying for the wedding, and they said, well, we'll give you some additional, because I didn't have enough for a deposit from my redundancy, but I had about half. And they said, we'll help you out with the rest. A bit weird about, but was convinced to do it, and bought a one-bedroom apartment, as you do, just to get on the property ladder, and struggled. The first couple of years, I really found it hard to pay that mortgage because I was working part-time and doing a never-completed PhD. But I put my head down and, got on with it. And then unexpectedly met my late husband when I was 39. He had not bought property. He was still renting, but he had saved up a bit of cash. And so he moved in with me. It was too small. After a few months, when we decided to get married, we decided to upgrade and buy a bigger apartment, basically a two and a half bedroom, nice post-war, lovely medium density apartment. And we were able to do that. That was, we both had good incomes. We were nearly 40. We paid for our own wedding because we'd had help prior. Mm-hmm. And then we lived there for 10 years until my husband became quite sick. And long story, but due to his disabilities, we needed to upgrade to a house. We could not afford to do that. But his parents had died and left us some money. And so we were able to buy a house, an actual house with 3 bedrooms and a garden, would have been great to pay off the mortgage where we were, but he was in a wheelchair by that point and it didn't work in the apartment. So we bought a house, maintained the mortgage, but couldn't have done that without an inheritance. There was just no way. And we were both professional people. We were 50 by this point. We would have been happy to stay in that apartment, but it was physically impossible. And then a year after we moved, my husband died. So I then had the mortgage and everything I thought was fine. He'd been sick for a long time and I'd been the main breadwinner for a couple of years. But then the bank got in touch with me when I went to them to say I need to change the mortgage to my own name and said, well, no, we don't think you can do that. You can keep the mortgage and take your husband's name off it, but you can't refinance without going through a whole new application because you are now a single mother, even though the mortgage had been only a year prior assessed on my income alone. So there was just this residual thing of, oh, she's a single mother, that's a red flag, right? And so I just left it. I've just left the mortgage as it is because I'm too nervous to try to refinance. Even though I'm eating the mortgage, I'm very comfortably paying. I mean, things always a stretch on a single income with a child. And I have considered downsizing again now that it's just the two of us, but it would have been so disruptive for my daughter after everything she'd been through. But I was really shocked by that attitude still exists. And I was surprised, even though I'd done all this research over many, many years looking at the gendered nature of the economy and particularly of housing. So we're all right. It just means I can't refinance and I can't redraw on that mortgage. But I've got an offset account. I'm pretty, I'm very financially literate and I'm fortunate that I have a pretty good salary and a fairly flexible job that means I can be a reasonably attentive mum. But yeah, that was a real personal insight to me I wouldn't have been able to get into the property market at all without help from my parents. My parents grew up in a very working class household. And, it just reminded me of when I was in my late 20s and that they wanted my dad to co-sign for a car loan, and it was just so gendered. Made me really angry because I know I'm okay, right? But there would be so many women that don't have the margins, that are pushed out of home ownership when their marriage breaks up or when a partner dies, and that they then end up back in the rental market, often with children in tow, or they've never escaped the rental market in the first place because a great number of women don't, particularly when they leave abusive relationships, for example. And it's one of the greatest indicators of poverty in old age is the gendered nature of the housing market. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. It's such an obvious example of exactly what we look at in the literature and exactly what we see in the data, but it's your life played out. I mean, there's so much within that intergenerational wealth transfer and how essential that is, the way that gender plays out, the way that you needing to, your caregiving responsibilities in that context, it's all part of it. I just on a very micro scale, my own experience of signing a loan with my then partner, despite me being the person who did all the negotiations with the bank, bringing the larger amount of money to the loan, being the main person who'd organised all of it. It was such a micro thing. They always listed his name before mine, even when I was like, I want my name to be first. They're like, oh no, we don't do it that way. I'm like, how? How is this still in our systems? These microaggressions.
It's nuts. It's nuts. I remember even when David and I bought a car years ago, I was obviously the one with all of the information, all of the willing to negotiate, and yet they kept talking to him as though I was not there, and he would go, please look at my wife, please look at my wife. So it's just so ingrained.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. I wanted to pick up on that comment you made about single mothers losing their home loans, losing their homes in a divorce or during a situation of family violence or with the death of a partner. And I'm going to be interviewing Jackie Galloway in a couple of weeks' time, who you probably know, and we've been discussing shared equity as a way of helping women to retain ownership of homes in those situations. I wondered if you had any thoughts on how the government stepping in as kind of a co-owner could be effective for someone in that particular situation.
It's really important. And the federal government has, with its home buyer scheme, opened up a specific tranche for single parents, and they are making a specific amount of home, the shared equity scheme increasingly available to women that are wanting to hold on to a home rather than buy a new one. And I think it's critically important, and we need to trust these women that they know what they're doing, right? There's so much condescension in the commentary around this. Oh, they'll get themselves into terrible trouble with the 2% deposit, and, and it's going to inflate house prices, and oh my God. These are women that if I had a company of my own with a really complex financial structure and no margins, I would hire a single mother to run it. There is no one better at making ends meet on limited amounts and stretching budgets and managing. And this goes through to the rental market as well. It's harder to get a rental if you're a single parent, right? It's this assumption that somehow it's still so pervasive that, you must have been irresponsible at some point or done something stupid, so therefore you're a risk. Whereas in actual fact, these women are paying rent. They're keeping roofs over their heads. We know, and we've talked about this, Kate, that, homelessness doesn't look like it does for women, because they will do anything to keep a roof over their heads. They'll cut everything else out first, particularly when they've got children. And so I think that shared equity schemes are smart. It's a way of people who don't have the bank of mum and dad or don't have that hand from family or friends to say, I know I can meet my repayments. I just need a hand getting in the door. And I understand that down the track, part of my, wealth or whatever the house appreciates, the financial return that comes to me will go back to the government. That is a decision I'm making to provide housing security for me and my kids. So I find it really patronising, a lot of the commentary about how risky it is to offer these people such low deposit mortgages and also that somehow that's going to inflate property prices when no one's concerned about the inflation of property prices going on through the bank of mum and dad going to people that otherwise wouldn't be able to get into the housing market. So, no, I think this is a smart thing for governments to do. I think there's further to go, and I think there are a lot of other financial interventions we could make in the market to support women into secure housing. But I do think shared equity is a good solution, particularly if you've been in that home, you've been managing the mortgage for years, you've lost one partner, but you can cover those repayments. I mean, the banks, it doesn't change the bank's lending criteria, right? So the bank's still not going to lend to you if they think you can't meet the repayments. So please can we have some respect for these women and say they know what they're doing and they're making an informed choice.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And it so often is such a moralizing rhetoric that we use around that. And I love that you're using this really strength-based way of talking about it, because it's true, like managing multiple competing priorities and budgets on really tight budgets, that is what you do in that situation. I've been reading data about social housing exits recently. And if you look at secure tenancy, I'm sure it's the same in private rental sector as well, but in social housing sector, there is no cohort better at retaining a tenancy, paying on time, never being in arrears, never being involved in damage of property than single parents. That's who are single parents, single mothers. So it's less risky than a lot of other groups.
Yes, they're going to take much better care of your property. Even in the private rental market, their number one priority is their kids. So, they're not having parties at home. And they're never going on holiday. They can't afford it. So they're there to maintain the property as well, right? So, these are the warriors of our society. These people that single-handedly raise children. I'm not including myself in that because I'm quite privileged. I'm talking about women on award wage jobs, managing part-time retail or care work around their very young children. They are heroes and they need to be trusted and embraced as good tenants. Yeah.
Yeah, just to talk about that notion of privilege. I have a question I've been grappling with for forever, but particularly on this podcast, around is there value in talking about gender? This is obviously a podcast about gender, but it also intersects with race, with indigeneity, with disability, with all of these other ways that we could think about diversity and disadvantage and impact. Do you think that we should be talking about a gender lens as our only focus, or is that the wrong kind of terminology and we should be broadening that? How do you think those things intersect?
I think a gender lens is important, and I've done a lot of work in this space and will continue to, because it's about how our economic settings affect people differently according to immutable characteristics, right? And so leaving the matter of whether one's gender's immutable aside, but your race, whether or not you've got a disability, whether you were recognised female or assigned female at birth and raised in a gendered society as a woman, whatever those immutable characteristics are, then policy has to take account of them. The overarching framework, though, is one of class. I mean, people who are born with a disability or acquire a disability, have mental ill health, are Indigenous, are first-generation migrants, particularly from refugee and disadvantaged backgrounds, and women are more likely to be lower income earners and in the working class. All of these intersectional things apply, and they apply slightly differently. And we've just been talking about some of the aspects of being a woman, particularly a mother, that affect your behaviour and your interaction with the economy differently. But when it comes to housing, it's an economic question as much as it is anything. I mean, it should be a question of rights and shelter and security and social cohesion, and all those things are important. But we live in a housing market, and we live in a very financialised market for housing in this country, I'd argue more so than just about anywhere on earth. And so class and income is the overarching lens, but those intersectional things really matter. And if we think about the fact that it's only 140 years ago, I mean, that sounds like a long time now, but in the great scheme of civilization, that there was, laws passed to allow women to own property at all in Australia. And that until for a long time as well, you couldn't vote unless you owned property in most advanced economies. So women's property ownership came about the same time as women's suffrage in the West. So it was part of becoming seen as a whole citizen, as a person that had basic rights in a democracy. So no, you can never let that lens go.
That was a very compelling argument for yes, let's think about it. And I think that's a really obvious example where gender and property rights are tied to each other. But I'm wondering, and we've kind of touched on this already in this discussion, but the key ways in which you see housing need and gender being related to each other. So how does gender change what you need in a home? And how does gender change what you can access in terms of housing?
In a practical sense, the biggest impact is that women are more likely to be the ones that maintain parental responsibility for children if a marriage breaks up, or are more likely to be single parents that have never married. And having children in tow changes very much how you relate to housing. So it's not just a place to rest your head at the end of a busy working day. It's the hub of the family. It's the place that provides a sense of security for children as they develop. Home is really important to kids. A sense of having a safe space and of providing the things that are necessary to grow little human beings. A place that's warm and sheltered and in which we can clean clothes and cook meals. So that's the biggest difference. And you see this play out in really, like if you think about it, you can see it everywhere. So when it comes to home maintenance, it's so common that the divide is the man, if in a heterosexual couple relationship, the man takes care of the outside. He puts the bins out and washes the car and he maintains the garden and does the home repairs. And the woman does the inside of the home and the nurturing, the stuff that, matters on a day-to-day basis to the family. We're breaking up those things a little more equally as generations progress, but it's still really sticky. From an economic point of view, women are much more likely, and per capita surveys, both that we've done with the Centre for Equitable Housing and the tax survey, have shown this year on year on year. Women are much more likely, the vast majority of them, to see housing as a home than as a financial vehicle. Men are much more likely to see a house as an investment than primarily as a home. Both may have aspects of both, but women would lean much more towards the idea of the home as a home. And that's borne out in investment statistics. So about 1 in 5 Australian males are a property investor, but it's only about 1 in 10 Australian women. And even in Gen Z, there's more than 10% of Gen Z men with an investment property and fewer than 5% of women. So again, this goes to the nature of our housing system and the tax system. You're more likely to buy an investment property if you're a high income earner because you're looking to offset your taxes, and men are more likely to be high income earners. So I think women also are more likely, a lot of research shows, to think much more deeply about moving home, about changing homes, because of how rooted they are in their communities and how much more connected they are with the local schools and the local shops than men who will think, well, I've outgrown this, or I can afford something better, and aren't as concerned about uprooting the family as women are. So all of these things play out in gendered ways according to the roles we're assigned socially, and also our, natural tendency as women to prioritise others.
I feel a little bit hurt in my soul on this topic of moving house because I moved house on the weekend.
Oh my God.
Never.
You look
never
remarkably
again.
well for someone that's just moved house.
Well, I mean, I only moved half a house because I'm slowly moving my home from home to home while recovering from a divorce. So
Yes.
This is also the life pathway in housing and how they intersect with each other. But my kingdom, or somewhere I can live for at least 3 years without anyone making me put a single damn thing in a box, please.
Yes. I hear you, Kate. I hear you. That's another part of the reason why I didn't downsize after David died, because I can't do it again. I'm just exhausted. Right. Yeah. So
yeah. The emotional labor, the physical labor, the financial impost of moving house is just horrific. No more of that. I wanted to talk specifically about care. And you've touched on your own experiences of caregiving, both with your daughter and with your husband, and presumably your parents, because I mean, sandwich generation, I imagine that's part of your story. How does caregiving intersect with housing in your perspective?
In so many ways, Kate. Primarily economically, it's caregiving that limits women's earning capacity. Women are the ones overwhelmingly, and especially in Australia where we have this really sticky sort of neoclassical model of a family where a man works full-time and a woman works part-time, particularly when children come along. And that's so due to caregiving, due to time taken out when a child is born, then being more likely to go back to work part-time, then again being more likely to interrupt your career when a close family member needs care, a parent, an elderly parent, etc. These reduce women's lifetime earnings. And so, the motherhood penalty, the care gap, means that not only do women struggle to progress up the income scale as men do, they're having children in their 30s, which is peak up the ladder career time for professionals, or if they're in services and care jobs, which are critically important, they're underpaid. There's a gendered nature by which that work is underpaid. Then they're working part-time because they want to be around for kids, and most people have, still the birth rate's falling, but most families still have a couple of kids at least. And so you've got different age children, getting them to school and back. And then you're more likely, again, to sort of say, well, mum or dad can't manage on their own anymore completely, so I'll start sacrificing some more of my time to help them out. Not sacrificing, I mean, they raised us and we do it in return. So all of those things affect women's earning power, and it affects their superannuation balance. So much less freedom in terms of having high incomes to buy their own home, but particularly to invest as well. I mean, home ownership rates are fairly gender equal in Australia, but property investment rates aren't. And so there's that aspect of it. The other way that care intersects is the home is the site of care. So it's where, as I said earlier, we do all of those things that nurture and care for our families. And women are the ones primarily in control of that. Again, we're using generalisations and talking about heterosexual couple households with children, but they're the years, and that's the major demographic in which people are building security and property wealth. And so, as I said earlier, the women tend to have more emotional ties to their homes, and particularly to the communities in which they live. And of course, we've traditionally been trained to think, I mean, there's some really interesting research in the UK that showed people are much more likely to judge a woman harshly if her home is untidy or dirty than a man. We are expected to keep up appearances. It's very important. So all of those things create a more emotional attachment to the home. But when it comes to outcomes and equality and security, it is that impact of care on lifetime earnings and security that has such an impact, and means that far too many women will either become homeless when they're fleeing domestic and family violence or some form of unacceptable relationship, or in a fairly happy divorce, if there's any such thing as a happy divorce. They usually include some kind of regret, but in a civil divorce, they're more likely to keep the house for the children, stretch themselves to the limit, perhaps give up their super to the spouse because neither of them can afford to buy each other out, and then find that they've got a roof over their head, but they can't afford to live in it as they age. And so these things contribute to the fact that women over 55 are one of the fastest growing groups of people at risk of homelessness, and of the fact that single women without adequate superannuation, and if they're in the rental market, are almost certain to live in poverty.
And the statistics show that very, very boldly. So what do we do about it? What are the best policy levers to address some of this gender equality? What do you think?
Well, the first thing we need, as you know all too well, is we need more social housing. We need more social housing that is suitable for women and their children, and also more social housing that's suitable for older single women. And that we need to be building that at scale, and we need to be building it in communities where people want to live, so that people can stay in their community, keep the kids in their school, etc. But we also need to be building the types of houses that suit those families in the social system. So that means a lot of single level 2-bedroom apartments for older women with a small garden where they can age in place. So the type of housing is really important as well. And the private rental market is just not going to fill that gap. It has been given the opportunity to do so for 30 years, and it is not doing so. And even where private developers now are building more denser housing, townhouses located in inner suburbs, 3-bedroom townhouse starting at $1.8 million. They're not targeting the people really in need. So governments have to do that. And I'm pleased to see state governments and the federal government putting a lot more resourcing into social housing over the last 4 years than we've seen in a couple of decades. But Hal Paulson at UNSW has run the numbers and said, look, this has stopped the decline, right? This has been good. It's stopped the massive decline, but we actually need more in order to fill the backlog and give particularly women with young children who are fleeing violent situations and older women at risk of poverty secure housing. Secondly, the financial markets need to be looked at. So things like shared equity. There are private shared equity products on the market. Again, they tend to be more attractive to people with some form of assets. But I do think the focus on providing shared equity through government programs to single mothers in particular is a really important thing to do. And as we've already covered, let's trust these women to make the right decisions. So I'd like to see more of that. And a lot of mainstream economists, it's terrible, it's a demand side incentive. It's these people need a roof over their head. They need some security, and we shouldn't balk at we intervene in the market every single day with tax concessions for wealthy people. So I get a little bit annoyed when people say we shouldn't intervene in the market to help the people that need help. And then other kinds of financial instruments, which is something I know you've been thinking a lot about lately, because there are women are very resourceful. Groups of older single women coming together saying, well, we'll buy a block of land and, build a cooperative housing village. And they struggle to access the finance they need. They struggle to access the support to get those projects up and running. We think in such binary terms about housing in this country. You're either rent, in which case you're a second-class citizen, or you buy, and then you must pour as much money into your own property as possible because it's tax-free. And once you can't do that anymore, you should buy another one and not maintain it properly. We don't think about different ways of living and what homes mean to people. And, we've done a lot of work at this over many years, going back almost 10 years per capita when I first started, and we did work, looking at older women's connection to community, what they wanted in a home. We dispelled that myth that they don't want to give up the family home when everyone's moved out. They're happy to give up the bricks and mortar, but they want to stay in their community, and those options aren't there for them. So it's about building the right type of housing, expanding the financial models available to women, and breaking down those cultural barriers that go, you're a bad risk, and ensuring that we are, as I said, trusting those women to make the right decisions for themselves, but with adequate support. Because why housing is seen as a consumer good rather than a service that people have rights to, like health and education, is beyond me. It's a mistake that society has made.
Yes, and there's such a compelling argument. We understand intrinsically the compelling argument for public health. That we all benefit
That's
when
right.
someone can afford to be treated
Yep.
for an illness.
Yep.
But when you look at the cost benefit analysis, you look at all the research, you get very good returns. Even if we're just talking about it financially, you get
Yeah.
massively good returns from having a universal access to housing, but we put them in different buckets, and
That's right.
it's irrational.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and I also take your point on kind of these path dependent trajectories because of the way we talk about renting and home ownership in binary terms.
Yep.
And there's all of these disincentives to do it in a different way. Yeah. It's
Well,
not
because,
even...
we hear this a lot, but we have a three-tiered system in Australia. So about a third of people own their homes outright, about a third of people have a mortgage, and about a third of people rent. And that renting cohort is growing with every year because younger people are finding it impossible to enter the second group. And those in the first group who own outright are splashing the cash on all kinds of, there's a lot to show, and there's some research out today, I think, that shows that actually the property investors are contributing significantly to inflation. Of course they are. I didn't need to see the modelling to know that. Of course they are. They're pushing up the price of housing. They're pushing up rents, and they're doing so to make a big capital gain. So it's completely out of whack. And the problem with a society that gets to that point, and this is true for men and women and non-binary people, is if you do not have the sense that you're going to get some return for your work, that there's an opportunity for you to build a good life, then the social repercussions of that are, we've seen it through history. So people will not put up with that for long. And at the moment, my personal belief is that it's a big part of the reason that many people are moving away from voting for the major parties, is that social contract that says we've got your back. If you work hard and do the right thing, you'll get ahead, has been broken for generations.
Yeah, I agree. I know that an anecdote is not a statistic or the truth, but my brother and I are as dissimilar as two siblings can possibly be.
Mm-hmm.
My brother has voted One Nation his entire voting career.
Yeah.
I'm from far North Queensland, this is why. But like the Christmas conversations in my household have always been, oh, why are you voting for Pauline? And my brother will say, oh, she cares about me. I want to go shoot some things. But recently, the conversation is, why are you voting for One Nation? He's like, well, the major political parties aren't doing anything for me, and it's ridiculous that a normal person can't buy a home. And it's once it gets to that point where you cannot achieve a good life within the current system, you need to find a way to find a new system, or at least a vision of a different system.
Yeah, and it's what drove Brexit in the UK and has driven Trump in America, is this sense that this is not working for me and I want to blow it all up. And this is a failure of the left, of my side of politics, of the Democrats in the US, Labor in the UK and here in Australia, that I expect the Conservative parties to be concerned about the propertied class. That's why they were formed as parties. They represented the landed gentry and the ruling class. The Labor Party in particular, Democrats a bit less so in America, they still came from a branch of the Jeffersonian Republicans, but Labor parties were set up to help working people. And what Labor parties did in the 20th century was disrupt that and say, yeah, we are here to make sure that you've got a house to live in and you no longer live in a slum and have to work, 60 hours a week in a factory. So the anger is right. Like the people are right to be angry at what's been allowed to happen. And it's absolutely the responsibility of the left of politics, if that label still applies, to fix it, because that's what we are meant to be here for.
Yeah, more of that, please. So I have two questions that I ask everyone at the end of an interview. And the first one is called vibing and venting. So which I just love. So the question is, what's one thing that you're vibing or excited about within gender and housing? And what's one thing that you need to vent about?
Okay. I'm vibing a lot at the moment. I'm trying not to get too excited ahead of this year's federal budget, but I do think I'm vibing on the vibe in the country that is saying, actually, it's time to fix this mess and we want to see some meaningful tax reform there. Since the government sort of started floating this idea that they might look at property taxation in the budget, and I have no special insight into that, by the way, it's not what I do. But the response of the media, of economists, even of business has been actually quite positive. Even the Financial Review has come out and said, yeah, actually, this tax is not working as it should, particularly in relation to CGT. And I give credit to a lot of people like Tom Walker and Centre for Policy Development, but really per capita and what we did over the last decade to say this is not just not fair, it's not productive, right? Having $10 trillion sit in property, in land, effectively, is a big part of the reason why we've got a productivity challenge in this country. So I'm vibing on that vibe shift around, yes, actually, this isn't too hard. It's not impossible. We can change the system carefully and without causing a housing market crash, because 67% of retail banking is residential mortgages in this country, which is stupid but dangerous. So I'm vibing on that vibe. And on the groundswell of younger people saying this system needs to change. A home is the least we can expect if we are contributing, functioning members of society. And it's the least we deserve when we can't contribute economically to society because we are human beings, right? So yeah, the vibe is making me happy. But I still need to vent about all those people, all those neoclassical economists coming out saying, oh, you can't touch this, it'll stop people investing. Oh, and at the same time, you can't possibly help young people into a home with support for a deposit because that's socialism and it'll drive up house prices. They are so contradictory, these two comments, right? On the one hand, we want to keep the tax that's driving up, it's good for us and the people we represent. On the other hand, we don't want those people getting into the market because it'll drive up house prices. It'll bring more competition for the first investor market. So the absolute inconsistency of it, but it has been exposed now, right? And that's the vibey bit that I love. But yeah, their arguments really, when you drill down and you keep pushing, it all comes down to please don't take away my rich boy toys. And I vent a lot about that. I get cranky at people that offer simplistic solutions too, right? We can't just nationalise the housing market overnight. We can't. And maybe if we were starting with a white piece of paper, we'd design a system that looks much more like Vienna's. I would like that too. But we're not. We have to be realistic about where we are and how we're going to get back to a point that gives people opportunity and agency. So, sensible solutions, please.
Yes, and I mean, Vienna took 100 years to achieve. It can't happen overnight. I also enjoy the hypocrisy of, oh, you're not going to save that much money because smart investors will just take their investment money and put it in a different system, a different market. But then also worrying, but these are the same people who'd be calling for additional money to go into venture capital and productive investments.
That's right. Yeah, it's a good thing. And they just changed their arguments according to the objection. Oh, well, but you think you're going to raise $250 billion over 10 years. You won't. We know we won't. We know people will change their investment behaviour. That's part of the point, right? Taxes are also to shape behaviour. We want more money going into, as we were promised when the CGT discount was introduced, we were told we'd become a nation of shareholders and entrepreneurs. We'd like some of that, please. We haven't got it. So, yeah, it's the hypocrisy of the highest order. Yes. I mean, and to take the CGT and negative gearing discussion to a gendered perspective as well, we know that the majority of the benefit goes to higher income earners and it predominantly goes to men. So absolutely, it is a rich boy's toy. It's rich boy's toys.
Totally. So the last question is, if you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, what would it look like? And how would we know it if we saw it?
It would look beautiful. It would look like about between 8 and 10% of social housing as a proportion of the market stock across the country, with really well-designed homes for families and older people with universal access provisions that are located in the communities in which they've always lived. It would look like removing those tax concessions that benefit the very, very wealthy and help them to hoard land and release it in little drips to people in poor condition. It would look like a really good mix of home types. I've said I'm a little concerned about all this focus on townhouses because they're not going to allow people to age in place, but they're a good thing in and of themselves. They're an and, please. That's good and, please. So more of those gentle density options. I mean, I loved living in an Art Deco apartment. It was as big as a small terrace house, you know, a lot less maintenance for me. And that they're great options for people, for young families and for older downsizers to have a little bit of garden, couple of bedrooms so that grandkids can stay over and the space to live a good life. So different housing types as well, less urban sprawl, fewer houses on the fringes where there's no facilities and where they're starting to encroach on arable agricultural land. And critically, the infrastructure alongside them. So, you know, the transport links, the medical centres, the schools, the childcare, the life that people need to live. I'd love an ambition to get everybody to a 30-minute city, you know, or even walkable cities. So a lot of this is urban planning reform, but none of that can happen until we fix the economic system that sees housing primarily as a financial vehicle. And that comes about through big investment in social housing, non-market housing. And, you know, people of the more conservative bent will be quite explicit if you push them hard. You're talking about non-market housing. Yes, I am. Yeah, this is not a market that should be left, but also reforming those economic settings so that the primary goal of housing is to provide not just shelter, but a secure and safe and comfortable and affordable home for everyone in the country. And big investment, this is happening already, it's not getting enough attention, but really expanding investment in Indigenous housing in remote communities and having those places co-designed by local elders and local Indigenous communities is really important as well. But also in, you know, the majority of Indigenous Australians actually live in the cities and they live in sometimes quite concentrated demographic areas of relative deprivation. So there needs to be a specific aim there with the social housing program too.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. I think that's a really great example, the additional funding going into Indigenous housing, a great example of the industry saying this system isn't working, the Housing Australia Future Fund isn't working, it's penalising smaller community housing providers, it's penalising First Nation housing. And Housing Australia Future Fund responding to that and changing the systems in which funding is delivered. Hooray for that. It's good to see that's leading to outcomes.
That's right. And that's good policy making. You know, the HAF was designed with the input of the social housing sector to provide a secure long-term vehicle for housing and at the same time urgently to get a lot of homes into the process quickly. And so, yes, it favoured those big providers in the first round and second round, but they're listening to feedback from the community and also understanding. And this is partly a function of housing having been brought together over the last couple of years. And again, kudos to the Centre for Equitable Housing for calling for a housing statement in the budget, and then we got one. And now housing is a Treasury department and they're talking to each other. So, we're putting several billion into remote housing over here, and yet the HAF is working against that. So let's fix those things. You know, let's make a system-wide approach. These things take time, particularly as the infrastructure of social housing was deliberately removed from the public sector in the Howard years, as were many social programs and programs for women, the Office for the Status of Women and other things. So bringing this coordination approach and the willingness to listen when policies aren't working or working against other areas of the portfolio is really important.
Yeah, I really hope it's sustained, because when I talk about housing policy, I always use the word lumpy, because there'll be this flurry of excitement. We saw it after the GFC with all of that money that went into nation building. Great outcome, but it lasted like 3 years and then it all disappeared again. And then, we have upticks and it's very exciting, and organizations build capacity, they bring on new staff, they take on all these new projects, and then we pull it again. So, yay, great. But please continue it.
I think a lot of people miss that was a fundamental purpose for the HAF, right? It's a model that sits outside of Parliament, and we would have to change legislation to abolish it. So we have to get it through the Senate. Whereas in previous years, the government still must fund housing directly, but when there's a change of government and a government comes in that does not believe in social housing, they just stop funding it. And so you get those waves. We got a big one in Labor with Kevin Rudd, GFC, then nothing for years, and now we're seeing it again. The HAF is intended to sit there in a way that an incoming coalition government can't just say we're cutting the funding. They would have to pass legislation through the Senate to get the HAF abolished. And that's actually quite an important thing.
Yeah, hooray for robust governance and vehicle.
That's right.
Anyway, thank you so much for this conversation, Emma. It's great. It's great that I thought we'd have an entire conversation about care, but of course we're housing and policy nerds, so we're going to cover off on a bunch of different things. But yeah, this has been really valuable. I appreciate it.
It's always lovely talking to you, Kate, and you do such important work. And I'm really looking forward to the second season of Homes Not Houses. Congratulations to you and Rebecca and all the team.
Next time on Homes Not Houses, I'll take a closer look at women's homelessness with Alison Heller, a social impact expert and a director at Urbis. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next episode. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.